Hey folks, welcome to Natural Selection and Other Ways of Evolution. Today we're going to talk about the stuff that we talked about Charles Darwin and a few additional details that might come up. The College Board thinks they're important, and so do I. So I want to start by asking you, what do this moth with the exceedingly long tongue, this cheetah chasing an antelope on the Serengeti, and this mouse that really well matches its surroundings have in common? They're all the products of natural selection and evolution. And remember that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Um, Theodosius Dobzhansky said that, and it's as true today as it was the day that he said it. He was a geneticist, by the way. And just remember, all of those first three examples are examples of evolution through natural selection. So traits that are most well adapted to the environment are the ones that are going to take hold within the species. What are some other ways that natural selection could be shown? Well, here we've got some pests that live in this field right here, and the farmer wants to get rid of those pests because they're eating his crops, so he sprays the field, and it turns out that one of these bugs, or maybe a few of these bugs, has a gene that allows it to survive that pesticide. Well, if it's one of the few survivors, it's going to pass that gene along, and when it does, its offspring are likely to have that gene as well, and we could create an entire species that is resistant to that insecticide. Human example of that. Here is the continent of Africa, obviously. If you look at the dotted areas, those are areas where there is a protozoan that causes malaria to happen is common. If you look right in the middle of that, you can see this overlay or underlay, depending on how you want to look at it, shows where the highest levels of sickle cell anemia are. And there's no coincidence here that some of the highest levels of sickle cell anemia are also sort of in the middle of these malarial belts. Um, so there's a mutation that causes sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia helps people to actually, it's not helpful if malaria is not around, but it does help you survive if malaria is something that's present in your surrounding area. So that has helped people survive and has become more and more common in those areas that malaria is common. So those are examples where we've got mutation plus natural selection. Now, in order for that to work, in order for natural selection to work in general, you have to remember that you have to have a variation of traits. So here we've got a bunch of mice and they vary in coat color from very light to very dark. And I'm sure that you could all imagine scenarios where this mouse might survive better, or this mouse might survive better, or mice on this end of the spectrum might survive better, or mice on this end of the spectrum might survive better. But given all things being equal, in any given environment, any one of these mice might survive better for a number of factors, whether it's because other mice find them more attractive, they blend in better, they are smaller so they can hide. There are all sorts of different reasons, but there's three different types of natural selection that you definitely want to know about, and those three different types are directional selection here. So if this is my original population, it's dotted down here. If this is my original population and all of a sudden there's a darkening of the environment, or this mouse has moved, this mouse species or a subset of this mouse species is moved into a darker environment with a darker sort of background, they're going to blend in better. So the whole species is going to trend that way. Same would be true for lighter. Or perhaps they're living in a scenario where you've got two different types of cover and two different phenotypes are selected for. So we have a light phenotype and a darker phenotype that are selected for at the same time. That's called disruptive selection. And then our final example would be if we have widespread the same sort of environment. Then it's going to probably favor one of the coat colors over all of the others, and that's going to be an example of stabilizing selection. And the number of mice that are that medium coat color are going to be obviously the highest number of mice, and the numbers of the other phenotypes are going to go way, way down. So How does that happen? Well, it happens because of mutations in the DNA. I know you'll remember that A, T, C, and G are the sort of letters that make up the code that is DNA that gives us our protein, which gives us all of our physical characteristics. We're mostly made of protein as well, so structures end up being what they are because of the order of those letters. And if I change one A to a C, it can cause drastic effects, or it can cause very minimal effects depending on exactly where in the DNA that happens. And we'll talk a lot more about that as the year goes on. So let's move on to our next sort of way that evolution can happen. And I want you to look at this beautiful bird. It's a peacock. Well, what's the advantage of this huge, showy tail? Well, if I am a male peacock, which that's what this is, and I'm trying to run away from a predator, you can imagine that this is not going to help it. This is going to be a liability. However, when it comes to mating, this is not a hindrance because it turns out that peahens really like peacocks with giant showy tails. In fact, the biggest, most showy tails that are out there are the ones that are the most sought after by the female peacocks. So until it becomes a hindrance to the male peacock to the point where it affects its chances of survival, that tail could, as long as the DNA exists, the mutations exist, the tail probably would keep getting bigger because the peahen wants it that way. Another example of that is this interesting construction in a field. We've got this bird called the bowerbird. It picks up all kinds of plastic and makes this really interesting archway, and it does it all. You can see there's like a lighter there, and there's some caps. It just finds this blue plastic, and it makes this elaborate arch out of grass just to impress females. So that's the bowerbird. It's not a nest. It has nothing to do with anything other than attracting a mate. And the male bowerbird that makes the most elaborate show is going to be the one that gets to draw in the mates. So there's another example. This bird is using a lot of energy to get all this stuff together and do all of this, and the entire benefit is to be able to mate. And what that does is that ends up producing, especially in like the peacock here, this is an example. The term that we would use for this when we have two different forms, depending on if they're male or female, is sexual dimorphism. So di means two, morph means shape. So here we've got two largely different shapes for the male and the female, sexual dimorphism. So that's a term that maybe you want to stick in your hat. It's kind of a $5 term. So there's the bowerbird again. And then we're going to talk kind of all at the same time about the next two ideas. So that's the non-random mating, sexual selection. So we're going to talk about gene flow and small population size now. So I want to use one of my favorite examples. We're going to pretend that this is the Grand Canyon here. And on one side of the Grand Canyon, we have the Abert squirrel, which is kind of like a little bit different than our gray squirrel, but largely the same. And then over here, we've got this squirrel called the kaibab squirrel, and it is just the most weird-looking squirrel you've ever seen in your lives. It almost looks more like a rabbit than a squirrel, but there it is. And let's just, for the sake of argument, say that this squirrel lives on the Kaibab Peninsula over here, and it's largely unaffected by the genes of the Abert squirrel, which is basically all around the Grand Canyon except on that Kaibab Peninsula. Well, one day, a hawk comes along and grabs an Abert squirrel and drops it over here before it gets a chance to kill it and eat it. Well, what's going to happen? Because these two can still reproduce together. What's going to happen with that is we're going to have a new set of genes that get mixed in with the kaibab squirrel, and that's an example of gene flow. So we have some gene flow into this population that wasn't there before, and that could change this population over the course of time. The same could be true the other way, but because the kaibab squirrel's population is smaller, it's more likely to have a large impact on the kaibab squirrel's population if an Abert squirrel is dropped in than it would on the Abert squirrel population if a kaibab squirrel is dropped in, because those kaibabs are pretty rare. Another example, I've got some caribou on the in the Arctic here on the plains and the taiga. Um, and we've got a population that basically lives up here and a population that basically lives down here. And certain parts of the year, their ranges overlap. And during those times, the ones that live in these areas could intermingle and have a little bit of gene flow in between the populations. But for large parts of the year, the ones that occupy up here are up here, and the ones that occupy down here are down here. So another example of gene flow in general. Um, Small population size. Imagine, for example, there's an organism that lives in this area before a landslide. After the landslide, obviously that organism isn't going to be around anymore in as large a number as it was before. Whenever we have a large population die off, something interesting happens with the allele frequencies. This has happened to tigers and things like that because of poaching, elephants, those sorts of animals. But what ends up happening is this thing called the bottleneck effect. So imagine that in this bottle we've got all of these different alleles for a certain gene. So here we've got a pretty healthy mix of blue and white, whatever, and some yellow mixed in. Well, if I was to take it, this would be like the big A, little a, those alleles. If I was to take and I was to cut the number of alleles in the population down because I'm breaking down the population in general, I'm killing off animals to a very small number, then you can imagine that the genetic variation in the ones that remain is going to be relatively small. And there's a very good chance that we're going to lose some variation as we go from that large population to the small population, which means that the species in general will not be as well equipped to adapt to any given environment if there are environmental changes. Another example of this, and this is an example of something called the founders effect. Dutch folks came down and they settled in South Africa. And the population of Dutch folks that came down to settle in South Africa happened to have a higher instance of Huntington's disease, which is a dominant neurological disorder that affects people in their 50s, than the average population of the rest of Europe. And to this day, that group of people that live down here, that settled here a very long time ago, still have a much higher instance of Huntington's disease than is true in the rest of Europe in general. So basically, we've got natural selection, mutation plus natural selection. Both of those are going to cause evolution. Non-random mating, well, that can cause changes because of sexual selection. It could also cause changes because of artificial selection, like humans breeding dogs and things like that for certain traits. Gene flow, that's when we have genes entering or leaving an environment in some way. And then small population size can also lead to big changes in a short time in a population. So when we take a lot of the allele frequency of the alleles of a certain frequency, if we take a lot of alleles away, we can change the gene frequency quickly within a population. And these are just two examples of that. Now, that brings us to, if you're looking at this list thinking, geez, that looked really familiar, it should look familiar because these are all of the positives of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium conditions. So ways for evolution to not happen. So if you're going to use the Hardy-Weinberg equation, you have to be thinking, okay, in this population, there's no natural selection. If it's going to be in a Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, no mutation, totally random mating, no gene flow, and extremely large population size. Well, all of those things are pretty unrealistic over a long period of time. We're going to talk more about why we use Hardy-Weinberg and why we would set up such an unrealistic set of expectations because obviously natural selection is going to be happening in an ever-changing environment. Mutation is happening just as a course of life. Random mating is happening all the time because of sexual selection. Things are coming and going, and there can be very small population sizes. So that's all for natural selection and other ways of evolution. If you have questions, come find me, see me in class, or stop by office hours, and I will talk to you later. Hope this helps.